For the purposes of our records, could I ask you to give your name and organisation, please? Start with you, Mr. Whelan.
Mick Whelan, General Secretary of the Train Drivers Union, ASLEF.
Thank you.
Rob Jenks, Policy Advisor for the TSSA Union.
Mick Lynch, General Secretary, RMT.
Thank you, and again, thank you very much for giving us your time this morning. In your written evidence to us, you've very clearly set out why you oppose in principle the minimum service legislation. But is there a way, a type of minimum service level arrangement that you could see yourself supporting? If Mr. Whelan, start.
Thank you, Chair. I don't think so. There's been a lot of questions this morning about how this operates in Europe and elsewhere. It doesn't operate, they don't utilise it, but where they do have it, the right to strike still exists. And we're introducing something fundamentally different that doesn't exist in other democracies. So it's an industrial issue, but it's also a wider issue on human rights and elsewhere. And within itself, we work within a safety critical industry. And every major tragedy that we've had, unfortunately, we've analysed, as we should do, appropriately, as this committee has done in the past. So post-Ladbroke Grove, they said that any safety critical member of staff, if they had road rage on the way to work or a domestic splat, someone should assess them, see if they're fit to carry out their role. Forcing people to go to work when their colleagues or their peers aren't at work will bring that pressure upon them and make it inherently unsafe themselves. And then we'll bring in further aspects, not just about how it's been identified, people might go naturally sick during these periods of time, but also maybe under the various refusal to work procedures will say that I do not feel safe in an industry that isn't fully staffed or where I'm pressurised to do something that I don't feel I should be doing. So we struggle with the concept.
Thank you. Mr. Jenks.
I would concur with everything that Mick's just put across to you. We don't think that this legislation is needed at this time. We don't think it would work, and you asked a lot of questions earlier about how it would work. We don't see it would work in practice, and we think it's undemocratic in so many ways. There's a number of points around that can be made. We see it as a way to dumb down, if we like, the role of employees in terms of democracy and work. And one of the quotes I wanted to use today was in relation to an academic from King's College London, where he says the right to strike is the vanguard of democracy, and we see it as an assault on that. And one of the main things as well we see from this legislation is that there will be some groups of staff who will never be able to strike. There are some groups of staff who are so key to the industry and the way they work and the way strikes can take place, they will have the right to strike withdrawn. It won't just be some of them. Chances are the way they work, all of them. And on that basis, we see it as completely undemocratic and a breach of their civil liberties and human rights.
I understand that your objection to the legislation that's currently proposed, but is there an alternative form of minimum service level that you think could work without raising the problems that you've just outlined?
Well, the only way we see it as working is not to have it in the first place.
Mr. Lynch, do you have any different points to...
Well, we will never support minimum service levels. It's undemocratic. It's unconservative, in my view. It goes straight to people's right to combine and to be democratic and have their freedoms expressed in a free democracy. And you're oppressing that. You're the Conservative government. And this goes back to the foundations of our democracy. Toll Puddle, the Combination Act and all the rest of it. This is your latest version of the suppression of the right to
just to be clear, this committee is not introducing anything. We're scrutinising.
Well, yeah, but you'll get to vote on it, so maybe we'll convince you to vote against it. That'll be the ultimate outcome. So we'll never support it. It won't work. It's going to make things worse. And they were being very careful earlier about what they do, but you've got to remember these people are under a direct instruction from the DfT, from the Transport Secretary. They have to comply with what he says. They've got no right to diverge in any way from the thinking that's coming from the DfT and from BIS at the minute, because they're under state control, which is a strange irony at the minute. You're getting evidence from private sector companies who are under direct state mandate, and you're empowering the state to tell people, to conscript people to go to work when they voted not to go to work under your legislation. So it will never work, and it will create more problems. It will be unsafe. Conscripting people to go past their own union's picket lines and operate complex signalling systems or drive trains is a recipe for disaster, in my opinion. I don't know why you're doing it. Nobody else does it. All this stuff about France and Europe. If you've seen the industrial action in France in the last few months, under alleged minimum service levels, they have completely novel ways of taking industrial action, including occupations and blocking tracks and all the rest of it. What you will do through this process is create novel industrial action. If we can't use traditional industrial action as you've been used in Britain for a long time, there will be novel forms of action, and there will be wildcat action, which is what happens in France and Italy and Spain and elsewhere. In Stockholm last week, there was walkouts all over the Stockholm tube network outside the legislation. So it's going to come back on the Conservative Party's heads, I believe, but it won't work whichever way you go with it. And of course we haven't got legislation. We've got the slimmest piece of legislation that many people remember. We're waiting for regulation to come out of the minds of somebody in the Department of Transport or the Biz Department. And we don't know what we're dealing with anyway.
Well, and that is the purpose of this inquiry, excuse me, is to explore what that regulation might look like. We're not debating the principles of the...
Shouldn't they be telling us rather than us telling you?
Well, we are questioning a wide range of witnesses and looking for their input. So in terms of shaping what those regulations might look like, are you engaging with the consultation process? Do you have a role in that?
Well, we've responded to the consultation, but we still don't know what's going to happen. So you could have a completely novel situation where we give 14 days' notice of strike action, and then, as we understand it at this time, the government or the companies give us 4 days' notice inside that 14 days of who's got to work. So it might be quite novel, whereas the companies are always taking us for injunctions. We may have the opportunity to take them for injunctions if they haven't served the notices properly. So I think it's going to be a complete pig's ear, but we will respond. And it's the stuff, it's unsafe, we believe. It's not going to work, and I don't think it will serve the passengers well. And if it's going to go to a national reduced timetable, people like train drivers and signallers will be completely conscripted. You cannot run an 80 or 90% or even a 50% railway service without conscripting all of the signallers and all of the controllers to operate that network. If you want to run a train down into Cornwall, into the north of Scotland, into rural Wales, and all of the towns that were mentioned earlier, Stoke, Middlesbrough, Portsmouth, all poor towns, by the way, I noticed. Maybe that's why they're not getting a service. I'm sure Guildford and Maidenhead always get a service during strike days. But it will be a disaster, and we'll all end up in court, and they'll spend even more money on fighting these cases than they have in trying to break these strikes. And if they'd used a fraction of the money in breaking the strikes in regards to settling them, we could all be back at work now anyway.
Okay. Mr. Whelan, is ASLEF engaging in the consultation?
We responded to the two current consultations. You're the only other one that's out there. You won't be surprised that most of our answers are in the negative. And we've tried, as trade unions, to talk to the regulator about the impact upon this and how they would affect the company safety certificates and how they could operate safely. And unfortunately, at that point in time, the regulator was unable to give us any answers. So the person who has to authorise and licence the people to operate the trains can't tell us how they think this would operate in a safety critical manner on the basis of the people that either travel on the industry or work within it.
Okay, and Mr. Jenks?
Well, we have got a consultation response together. We've taken the point of view that we don't agree with it, so we're not responding to all of the questions in the passenger service consultation. But one of the points that we have certainly made in our consultation is that the extent of industrial action since July last year has been in large part been down to the Secretary of State himself, because the application of national rail contracts, which Mick just alluded to, and the requirement that the Secretary of State directs essentially what they can do and anything to do with employment relations. And if you look at national rail contracts, they're all the same, even to the extent that the same clauses are numbered in the same way. you'll see in there that everything is under direction from the Secretary of State, and our negotiators went to meet with employers frequently during the recent round of industrial action, and whilst they were cosy chats in one sense, when it actually came down to doing the business and getting a deal, oh sorry, we can't make an offer, we can't move this forward. So that sense of frustration boils over. And one of the things I also wanted to add, Chair, is it's very easy for people looking into the industry to see that railway workers perhaps aren't quite as dedicated as maybe they should be. But I can tell you, having been an ex-railway worker, and all of us around this table are, and knowing thousands of railway workers, they are extremely dedicated, extremely professional, and don't take industrial action at all lightly. And so I'll paint that different picture. Industrial action is after a long process of negotiation and frustration in terms of that negotiation, and is only taken as a last resort on the basis that nobody wants to lose money in taking industrial action, bearing in mind workers don't get paid when they take industrial action, unlike the train companies who still get paid their money from government.
Thank you. Gavin, could I turn to you next?
Thank you very much. Chair, you may have heard my questions to the previous panel with regards to the services during industrial action that are provided to certain parts, and obviously Mr Lynch, you've just addressed some of that in your answer. But before I turn to that, the government, and I very much take with your first responses, but the government have proposed two options. So setting the level, a proportion of the normal timetable, or establishing a priority route map, which is kind of, I suppose, similar to how industrial action days are operated at the moment. I think you've all said that this legislation won't work, but in terms of those two approaches, does either of them potentially stand any better chance than the other? I'll start with you, Mr. Whelan.
No, because as you've highlighted in your questions, we're in a fractionalised industry where the domino effect of one part not running impacts the other. And also, when you introduce legislation like this, the expectation of travelling public dramatically increases. And so you have the same amount of capacity trying to use the lesser services, which brings the inherent risks that are associated with that problem. And when people get to a certain point, if certain trains are running, they'll expect the associated trains connections to take place. Not everybody plans their journeys in the way in which they like, which we would like. And as you highlighted with the disabled issue, then disabled people have their journeys truncated or can't travel at all. So there is no way in the way we currently have the railway structured, that whereby it's left to individual operators. And also there is part of the legislation that fundamentally concerns from the Henry VIII clauses that allows the Minister of State for any relative area or rail to turn it up or down as they want. So how that's going to be done safely and accurately and in a manner which we all understand, we don't know. We don't see how practically and objectively it can operate that way in either scenario.
No, I was made the point about all controllers or signals would be conscripted to deliver minimum service levels. If they were to design it in a, again, similar way to industrial action days are carried out at the moment, would that change? That there only be a proportion of controls and signals that would have to work on those days?
I don't believe so. I mean, the railway is a 7-day-a-week, 24-hour industry. So if you're going to run trains throughout the day, the station has to be open throughout the day. The signal boxes have to be open throughout the day. The rocks have to be open throughout the day. So we don't see how it won't adversely impact certain roles in the industry more than others. And is the intention then to indenture some people more than others?
Jenks?
Well, I'd agree with a lot of that. We organise a lot of controllers in Network Rail and the train operating companies. And the way those people work with highly specialist knowledge, all you have to do is spend time with the controller and you'll come across just how specialist their knowledge is, the way they work, and the fact that they're 24/7 shift patterns, and all those things that come together mean that they would be, if there's any sort of minimum service level, if they're in dispute, they would be required to work because of their degree of knowledge, because of the way they work. And there are other groups, and we've mentioned signallers as well in WhatsApp, and I'm sure there are others, faulting teams, for instance, with signal issues. So you have teams of people who go out and fault signals, fix signals when they go down, and those people would have to be kept, otherwise you may have a signal issue somewhere and we haven't got the team. So these minimum service levels would require those teams to be on duty as well. Bearing in mind that railways are mostly a 24/7 operation.
Mr Lynch, anything to add further to what you've said already on some of this, but also you've touched on the lack of information, or we're waiting for the regulation for this fairly small bill as it stands. What's your level of expectation and the level of detail that you're going to be privy to from the Secretary of State?
Well, I think they're going to make it up as they go along. It's just a suck it and see piece of legislation. I don't think they understand the railway. I don't think the people in the Department for Transport understand the railway. They've got 60 people working on the current dispute, which has obviously been a raving failure. If they want to then go into the actual operation, the nuts and bolts of how you operate a railway on a strike day or during any other industrial action, I think they'll be completely lost. So I think there'll be a lot of backtracking and reversing. There'll be a lot of pressure coming on them from passenger groups, devolved authorities, national governments, as you've mentioned. I think it's just going to be a mess. I don't think anyone actually knows how this legislation is going to be formatted. And I think the worst part of that is it's the people that are in charge seem to have the least idea. That's why they're floundering around, asking everybody else how they should conceive their idea. So I'm as wise as anyone else. I don't know what's going to happen. I do know that some of our members are going to be served with notices to go to work. And if they don't want to go, and they refuse to go, they will probably be sacked. And that will poison industrial relations with the people that you've just had sitting here every day of the year. If they sack 500 of my signalling members, well, we're going to be in an absolute crisis. If they sack 30% of all the drivers in the country because they won't go to work across their own picket line, where are we going to be on the railway? It will be a permanent disruption of our railway. Then we'll have to have disputes about getting those people re-employed. We'll have a P&O situation where everybody's getting sacked because they won't break their own strikes. I don't know if that's what the government wants, but that is very likely to be where we go, because we will have a strategy of non-compliance because it's an unjust law.
And where, obviously I made the point already that the First Minister's said to the STUC that it wouldn't be implemented, not a single work notice would be issued in Scotland and whatnot. And if Wales were to take the same approach, and potentially whatever devolved authorities, London, whatever, where there is semblance of local control, how will that in any way work for any kind of national service or services that cross borders, be it metropolitan or national? How's that going to work? I'll start with you, Mr Lynch, and work way across.
Well, I
think I might know your answer.
I think it will be chaos, but I think the government is only concentrating on what they perceive to be England. They've got this idea that as long as you keep certain routes happy, their hinterland will be okay. And I don't think they care what will happen in Wales and Scotland. That's my perception. And the railway has taken a decision they don't particularly care about it during the disputes. And this is the current dispute, which is sponsored by the government and paid for by the taxpayer, is a DFT Westminster dispute that affects communities outside of that prerogative. And I think this is largely concentrated on that. And I think we'll start another constitutional issue. If the Scottish Government says we don't want that, they'll soon be pressing further for the devolution of employment law. And then we'll have further conflicts where people involved in a strike in Scotland could be treated differently than people on strike in Newcastle or Carlisle. It's creating more of a mess than we've already got.
We've been pushing for devolution of employment law for some time, including fire and rehire and everything else. Mr Jenks, you got anything to add to that?
I don't think I have, actually. I think Mick's perfectly well covered it.
Okay, I think there's a logistical aspect to it as well. Yeah. At this moment, people assume that people go out and back. That doesn't happen. Journeys are fractured. People do different patterns, different timetables, are relieved at different locations. Some people have 4,500 seats, some people have 5, some have different agreements and whatever. But what does occur to me, that when you try and operate a piecemeal service, then the day after and the day after that will be impacted, because recovery to get back to a standard pattern timetable of any sort goes out the window. Whereas when there's very little running or nothing running, you can just move off again and greater capacity and greater ownership of what you're doing post it. And of course, all of these things, I think has been highlighted earlier, will lead to more strife, not less. The only bit of information we did have was that little bit of impact assessment that said that the bill itself would, if there was 1 day's action now, it's quite likely to lead to 6 or 12 days action to possibly have the same effect, which again I think is detrimental to the industry, detrimental to industrial relations, and of course is detrimental to the travelling public.
It's happy to bring up logistics. The last question is about freight. To yourself, you said in your written evidence that you assumed a minimum service level would need to be agreed for freight operators as well, which isn't in the consultation. Why do you say that?
Well, the way we squeeze freight in at the moment's in between the existing passenger trains. So freight actually grew and actually operated better during the pandemic than at any other time, which shows the need for further investment elsewhere, but that's a debate for another day, right? Where the real issue here is that freight will traditionally still run in the antisocial bands, won't it? It will run in that period of time between late at night and early in the morning when many passenger trains don't run. So I don't think it has the same impact on freight, but this is directed at public operators in government contracts. Freight is privatised red and tooth and claw. They're not bothered if Freightliner don't run. They're not bothered if DRS aren't running. Maybe DRS is not the right example, sorry, because they are publicly owned and have the nuclear commissioning stuff. But most of the freight operators don't come under these piecemeal government contracts, aren't part of this government dispute that we have at the moment, where people are now using this hammer to crack a nut.
Any specific effects of freight operators being left out that you can think of?
Not at this moment in time. Where it does impact, and it might be more directed to my colleague, of course, is the infrastructure work and the maintenance at weekends.
Yeah. Okay. Anything to add on?
Well, I think from my perspective, I think mixed picture up about weekend working and that sort of thing, where there's an issue there. And the fear we have, of course, is that the Secretary of State's reserving to himself consequential amendment powers, isn't he? So this is what it might look like now, but what's it going to look like in 6 months' time?
The same with every bill that comes forward these days, I'm afraid. But Chair, back to you.
All right, thank you. Mike, I can turn to you next.
Yes. Morning, gentlemen. I'll start with each one in turn. So Mick, Rob, then Mick. How's the minimum service levels as proposed at the moment going to apply to members? Thinking about job roles, it could be routes, for example. What the obligation is going to be? What's your understanding at the moment? Start with Mick.
Well, again, we haven't had the benefit of the DFT and the management workshops. All we get is the opportunity to respond to your consultations, to ask the regulator the question they couldn't answer, and then put our own opinions in place. So quite simply, on the basis of my 38 years experience in this industry, operating at all levels of it, I can't see how this can be done safely on a regular basis. And if one of the consequences of this is rather than people taking 1 day's action, they take 5 days action, then you've got 5 days of minimum service levels and the compound effect of the impact upon safety and the other associated issues we keep highlighting. So I remember when there was a National Fire Brigade strike some years ago, and we were in a safety consultation, and we were told unless we ran all trains during the fire brigade strike, the knock-on effect, the domino effect to public safety would be massive. More people would be driven into their cars, more people, whatever else. I don't see how minimum service levels don't have the same sort of impact on associated health and safety or emergency services, right, in the future. So again, I think it's not just about the railways, it's also about the ability, if there's other areas that are out on strike at the same time, our ability to function in a way in which allows the people who work within the industry to operate safely.
Could you repeat the question, please, Mike?
Yes, it's about how it's going to affect, well, your understanding of the moment in terms of the legislation, how it's going to affect your members. And that could be, I mean, people refer to signallers. Is it going to compel signallers to work? Are they going to lose their right to strike, for example? How will it affect the routes and different employers?
So, I think the first thing I'd say is the railway is integrated. And obviously, an industrial action can take place in one particular firm, or it can take place across the industry or across several firms. And so the effect can be different in terms of who's on strike in that sense. But one of the key points, I think, is this thing about prolonging the situation. So you say the union carries out its strike ballot, it comes out with a result, notifies the employer, and on that basis the employer then says, well, we want you 3 there, or you 10, or 20, or 100, whatever it is, to come into work. So then you have the issue then about how do you deal with all the people who are going to be not going into work, people who are perhaps going sick instead, rather than being part of the minimum service level. And then the strike becomes longer and longer and longer, because one of the impacts is going to be that whatever the length of the industrial action is, the effectiveness of that strike is going to be weighed by the employer or the government. So you can see now you can have everybody out, or not, as the case may be. But then the employer will look at the dynamic from that. Do I have to listen to what the trade union is now saying? Because half of their staff, or whatever the figure is going to be, still have to work. They've lost their power in that sense. So strikes in that sense become longer. They have to become longer to become more of the nuisance factor, if you like, the disruption factor. So that's one of the failings of this legislation, to my mind, about how this works.
Well, if we move on to the example of London Transport, might be useful, because we've spoken a lot about the mainline railways, often called, but the more you think about it, if they command the London Mayor or TfL to run a service, I don't know, 50%, and they've got to open all the subsurface stations, every single grade on London Transport, London Underground, will be affected. So all the drivers will have to go to work, I would imagine, to run that service. All of the customer service people will have to go, because they're safety critical in the sense of running the subsurface stations, the escalators, fire drills, and some dispatch roles. And all of the signalling staff and control room staff will have to go to work. So that will be a complete conscription of labour, and it will nullify the strike. So you won't have the right to strike. So it is a network. It's not called a network for no purpose. You cannot simply say, I've got a load of drivers that I've commanded to go to work. The railway will just run. And you've heard that even from the employer. So everywhere you look, it will end up with multiple grades, and perhaps the only grades that will not be conscripted will be the management grades that are currently operating the railway when we're on strike. It's quite a strange situation. An ironic outcome is that the people that are currently breaking strikes won't have to break strikes because they'll compel the people who are on strike to break the strikes. That's a bit of a strange situation. So I think all grades will be affected in all of the companies, but I don't really think anybody knows at the moment how it will work.
I think that's one of the interesting points as well, because our union represents managers in the industry, and sometimes managers are involved in these sorts of disputes and take industrial action, other times they don't. But in the circumstance that Mick's described, even they will not be able to take industrial action, because this will make the situation worse.
I mean, on that point, is it going to make it better or worse? Industrial relations, this piece of legislation, well, it's not even legislation, but as it's drafted,
Well, naturally, it'll make it worse because there'll be a value judgment made on impact. And if it takes more time to have the same impact, or to allow people to exercise their right to strike, depending on what the proportion or percentile is, there's going to be more action, and more action short of a strike. It's a natural byproduct of what's being proposed, unfortunately. And therefore, then our experience is the more action, the worse industrial relations, the longer it takes to resolve. The longer it takes to resolve, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, doesn't it?
Yeah, I agree entirely with that. One of the whole points of this legislation appears to us to be deliberately detrimental. I use that phrase quite deliberately because the way the whole process has worked is not just about the minimum service level, it's about the whole process that goes into getting to the stage of actually calling industrial action. Inevitably, that's going to cause a bitterness and a breakdown in relationships. Most of the time, relationships with railway employers work. There are times when they don't, but generally we get along. Most things are resolved without any recourse to industrial action. But when things do go wrong like this, and minimum service levels are imposed, and those relationships will inevitably become broken. And some employers are very litigious, so anything they can use to stop the strike, they will use, and that only causes bitterness. And when you're a member, and bearing in mind with membership-led organisations, when your members are seeing this, and they're feeling that frustration, so the industrial action that's taken place in the last 6 months or so has been led by the members feeling aggrieved that after 3 years they still had no pay increase, despite all the work they've done during COVID. A number of members lost their lives, others got long COVID. All through this process, you can imagine what that would be like if a minimum service level is then instigated and prevented them from striking.
Well, I think will be seriously detrimental. I mean, we speak to Tom and Jamie and all the others all the time, fairly cordially. And I think during these current disputes, it's the credit of everyone, to be honest, that there hasn't been a breakdown of relationships at any level, I don't think. If Tom and Jamie and others start sacking our people as a result of taking lawful industrial action, that will lead to the complete deterioration, because we will not be able to sit with them when they're either being forced by the minister or by their own volition to sack our people for taking what, a month before could have been lawful industrial action. That will lead to a complete breakdown. I don't see how we'll resolve any disputes if hundreds of our people, maybe thousands potentially, are being booted out. It's just not going to help anyone. I don't think they want to be in this position. If I'm honest with you, I've sat with all of these people for many hours over the years. Not one of them has said to me they want this power and this legislation. They've got no idea how it's going to work, as you've heard, and they are being press-ganged into it as much as anyone else. I don't think anyone wants to be in this position. Because if they don't sack people, what are they going to do? You're putting yourselves in a position where you're given an instruction by the Secretary of State to carry out a minimum service level, and if it doesn't work, what's the Minister of State going to say to you next? He's going to say, or she's going to say, I want those people sacked, so that the next time they come to work. I don't know if you politicians want to put themselves in that position where they're commanding chief executives to dismiss people for taking strike action. But that's the road you're headed down. You're interfering directly into private businesses about how they deal with their staff, collectively and individually.
Let me give you a scenario. So a signaller has been served the works notice, and there's a picket line, and they refuse to cross the picket line in this democratic state we call Britain. And what are the legal consequences for that signaller, and what are the consequences for the travelling public?
Well, they lose their indemnity. We don't have a right to strike in this country. There is no right to strike whatsoever. You breach your contract of employment every time you go on strike, and you're indemnified from legal or disciplinary action by the public, by businesses and by your employer. They will lose that indemnity, so they can be subject to the costs of the disruption, and they can lose their job, and they could potentially end up in court because of the costs. So this goes back to the Taff Vale judgment in 1913, when it was my union that was subject to that by a coal company taking our union to court, was nearly broke the union, which was the object. That's where we're going back to, but you'll also be picking on the individual. So they will be sacked. How we will get ourselves out of that position, if all of those, you put the company under pressure then, what are you going to do about it? These people defied that work notice, having voted to go on strike. I mean, some of you lot will have to work that out for us. You are the people making this decision, and you're the one that are going to put ordinary women and men in this position with their employer, and the employers will be in a similar position, an invidious position, where they've got to make these choices under pressure from the government and by the Secretary of State, who goes on the television and says, I'm just a good broker. I put these people together in a room and I hope they can find a way, which is completely untrue. It's in the passenger service contract. They're going to go further than just being involved in the negotiations. They're going to be in the disciplinary procedures as well, pressing them to be dismissed. Yes. It's the inevitable outcome. Now, the effect on the public will be that it's likely to come to their town. If they work in another industry and there's more industrial action, the government will extend these powers, but it won't resolve the current dispute we're still in, and it won't resolve future disputes. It will make them intractable, I think, because the first thing the unions will say is, we will not leave victimised members behind. That's where we'll be.
Final one to you all. Are you going to challenge this legally?
Yes.
Yes? And what routes are you looking at the moment? What are your options?
Well, when somebody writes the regulations, we might know. We're all in this position, aren't we? But we will do whatever we can. We will take, and we'll urge the TUC to have a non-compliant strategy. Hopefully we'll do that collectively, so we can do that in the European Court. We can do it in our own courts, depending on how these work notices work. If you look at the history of the legislation since the Tebbit laws, I'm not going to go back over all that, but all these iterations of the laws, they've all ended up in court. They've all ended up with challenges from employers, challenges from various parties, Then you end up with a bit of equilibrium. You find out how it's going to work with all the ballot thresholds and all the rest of it. It settles down, and then the government comes back, or one government comes back and makes a new set of legislation because they weren't content that the unions had defeated or got round the previous legislation. I imagine we'll be involved in that for the next 5 to 10 years. Until somebody serves a work notice on a group of workers, we won't know what the challenge will be. So there are people in certain inns of court around here that will be rubbing their hands, thinking this is great, this is a new area of law. I'm sure the Tories were elected on the basis that they were going to get rid of red tape. But you're bringing in a new set of law that all these lefty lawyers, as you call them, can challenge. So that will be an interesting development.
And it'll also be intriguing to see where the legislation goes, and then where the employers are currently fully indemnified for any strike action or have force majeure clauses in the previous contracts post-COVID. I'm not sure inherently that can still exist if you bring in legislation that forces people to come to work and force them to operate services. How can you be indemnified for any action and contractually protected from any penalties and also then have the rights to do this? I don't think that's correct.
Thank you. Rob, finally.
I concur with what my colleague said. At this stage, we don't know what the regulations will look like, which will give some flesh on the bone possibly to what this Act is all about. The Act is so loose, how can you possibly at this stage identify anything other than a worst case scenario about the way it's going to work, because it is so loose. Apart from the fact that we object to minimum service levels, that is a major consideration in our legal approach to it, will be what that detail looks like. And as Mick was saying, the train operating companies are indemnified, but the train operating companies are also controlled by the Secretary of State, and it's an opportunity for him to be able to crack down on workers he wants to. And bearing in mind that the minimum service levels aren't just applicable to rail. I know we're just talking about passenger rail today, but there are 6 categories of workers, including the health service and others. So it's going to be a shared burden that trade unions and employees are going to have to carry going forward. I am concerned about the litigious nature of what's been proposed, because it's inviting. That's why I used the word deliberately detrimental earlier. It's not just the minimum service levels, it's all the conflict that goes on, legal conflict that will go on to understand what it actually means in practice. And the way the process, what we know the process will work, will only make that worse. And it will confuse and frustrate industrial action all the way. And that's what it's designed to do.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's from me.
Yep. Thanks, Mike. Jack.
Thank you, Chair. And we've seen, obviously, in some cases where certain unions are on strike, others are not. How would you expect minimum service levels to work if we've got one union on strike but another that isn't on strike?
Well, we don't, and that's our problem. So at this moment in time, picket lines aren't there to deter the people that have balloted from coming in. It's to explain your case and articulate your voice to other workers. Picket lines are there to encourage other people not to go to work. So how in future we got minimum service levels where the people on strike are forced to go in, but the people who aren't on strike might be convinced by the picket line of the righteousness of a cause not to go in, and how that would work in future, and whether the same legislation, if they don't go in, they can automatically be sacked or whatever might work. We don't know. This is a really horribly, badly written bit of legislation that truly is going to make things 1,000 times worse and confuse all industrial relations. And at this moment in time, the bulk of workers that are not involved in strike will tend to go in. When this legislation comes in, I do wonder if that will change.
Have you got any views on that question?
Well, I don't know if it will provoke people. At the minute, people who aren't in unions have the right to go on strike, by the way. And I don't know who they're going to pick for a work notice. So if the RNT was on strike and other unions weren't, are they going to put work notices on everybody in case they don't cross a picket line? Because you have the right, as a non-trade unionist or a worker in another union, to not cross a picket line and be protected and indemnified. So I don't know if anyone's thought about that maybe everybody won't come to work. And maybe all the people that aren't in the union won't come to work because they won't get a work notice. Who knows? Will the employers demand to know who is in a union and who is not in a union? They don't have the right to know that at the moment. So I don't know how it's going to work. I don't think anyone else knows how it's going to work, which is what's wrong with the legislation.
Do you think it would differ if it were different types of workers on strike? Because obviously we've got differing, we've got train drivers, we've got, as you say, signal operators, things like that. Do you think this legislation would work differently for different types of workers?
Well, I imagine the employers will prioritise who they want to work. So if I don't suppose that they want somebody in accounts. They're that bothered about whether they come to work or not on a strike day. I'm sure they'd like them to, but they certainly will want signallers and train drivers and conductors to come in. But there are lots of other people out there, and it depends what the strike is, how many people are involved, which grades are involved. So if you take a London Underground strike, they tend to be a coherent group. If you've got train operators, it could be one train operator on strike, another train operator not on strike. But they are often co-located and they get knock-on effects. So I've got no idea what the effects will be and how they will deploy their powers. I'm not sure the people that are writing it know how they will deploy their powers either, because we haven't seen any of the powers, as far as I know.
Do you have any views on, the different impacts that it might have on different types of workers and different unions?
Impact in the sense of being required to work?
In terms of how it would work with, if there was a requirement on certain types of workers and not others?
I think, like Mick was explaining, we don't know the details. We don't know what the intention will be, and no doubt there'd have to be some sort of an assessment about who would be required. But there are certain groups of workers that if they were on strike or there was a dispute going on, they are key to running the railways. And like I said before, particularly the control staff, I have in mind when I say that, the group that we organise in a lot of companies, if there's any sort of dispute on, they are required to be in work. Now, if they're not in dispute, they can come to work, can't they? But if they would be in work. But if they were in dispute and others were in dispute and not on strike, would they be required to come in as well? And that's the sense where, I'm not sure I made that very clear, but the point I'm trying to make is that for those, some groups would be required to be in work in an industrial action, even if another group could take time off. So, like the controllers,
extra pressure on those staff who are not on strike.
I don't know about that. We don't know the detail what that would look like, because
it's quite possible, isn't it, that those staff who are not striking, that they would have to take on a lot more of the shifts.
It depends on the role the person's doing, really. I'm thinking in terms of control staff, if they were in dispute and they're all out. On the other hand, once they're out, then a work notice will suddenly appear and they probably will be required to work each time they were taking industrial action.
I think it's intriguing. I mean, there's no assumption you can make people work longer or do anything different. They will still have their terms and conditions. They will still have their normal roles and responsibilities. And in a complex industry such as the railway industry, where you could have 3 different drivers or signal people relieving each other at different times at different points of the day and undertaking different activities, just the idea that you can put a proportion of people into work and all of a sudden they can cover X amount doesn't quite work that way. Trains have to be prepared, they have to be put away, they have to be mobilised, immobilised, they have to be put together and broken apart to go in different directions and go in different routes. So it's not just quite simple as saying that the people who come in may have to work hard or whatever. That can't be done. You can't. You've already indentured them, made them slaves. I suppose you could force them to work every hour that God gives on top of that, but I don't think that's the intention. Where I find it intriguing is that already we're seeing this legislation in what was traditionally considered essential services, police, elsewhere. Now, they want the right to strike because of the legislation now being forced on others over minimum strike levels. So if every worker is now deemed as essential, at what point does it stop?
There are obviously emergency service workers who rely upon these services to get to work. So, in that sense, these services in many cases would be essential as well, I would suggest.
Well, we could go into a different debate about truncating timetables, not caring about people in certain areas of the country getting to or from work and having services as key workers or emergency workers to get to work. That might be a debate for another day. at this moment in time, then why would you want to exacerbate a situation to make it more difficult for people to get to work if strife is going to be longer and harder as a consequence and byproduct of this legislation?
In terms of, Mr Whelan, in terms of what you said to us at the last committee meeting we had where you gave evidence, you particularly referred to that you don't obviously recognise RDG, that you would potentially go on for 2-3 years with these strikes, and obviously that's been reported in the media as well. As you said, you're against these proposals in principle. Don't you think that the reason why the government have decided this is necessary is because of that hardline approach that you've taken?
I don't think the hardline approach has come from the trade unions. The RGG was created many years ago as a
all trade union, I'm saying particularly.
Okay, I'll speak about my trade union then. The RDG was created several years ago for the cartel that was given the opportunity to run the railways in the UK by the UK government. And they've had broken up many times. The DfT has carved the map up many times, and many bed operators have handed the keys back and been given future opportunities to hurt and pillage our industry. When they created the RDG, they very kindly were going to let the RMT and ASLEF be associate members of a group that we weren't advised about and whatever. We did not take up that opportunity. So what we did do, right, post-COVID, when we have the government-led strikes we have now, was find a vehicle to talk. We've done that. We've tried to find a solution to this. We're trying to find the way out of the strikes. Other than the vehicle that we jointly created, there is no vehicle. And when this, allow me to answer your question. When this is over, we'll go back to never talking to the RDG again, because there's no reason for us to do so. It does not exist for any purpose within our industry, for consultation or negotiation. It's not a body, right, that operates within the bargaining machineries, right, of the railway companies or the trade unions in the United Kingdom. We are using that vehicle at this moment in time to try and get us out of a dispute. Now, if you'd rather we didn't, that's fine.
Paul.
Thanks, Chair. Two different subjects I just want to touch on, but firstly, safety and access of vulnerable people. You heard in the earlier discussion that I know there have been concerns raised, particularly by the RMT, about where safety would be in this situation. And in the previous discussion, they gave us reassurances that they didn't think that would be the case. Do you agree with that situation?
No, I think they gave you a reassurance to do a risk assessment. So what they do at the moment, when they're getting managers to break strikes, is they put them on a training course for 4 hours, which for a safety critical member of staff would be at least 6 months or maybe a year. And then they put them out. So what they'll do is risk assess it, and they would come up with a risk assessment that says, we don't think there is a greater risk, or the risk can be managed. So that's just health and safety speak for saying, we'll just take the risk. And so if we stress safety critical staff by making them come to work on pain of being dismissed, they will just say that's no greater danger. We think they will continue to take that risk. I think they will probably continue to use managers fairly extensively where they can, because I think they're reasonably comfortable with the situation at the moment. I mean, during this dispute, Network Rail sets down the minimum standard that they're going to run, which could be 20-30%, as you've heard, and they will try to operate a system within that, and it's got a defined time period. Now, they seem fairly comfortable with what they're doing. I don't know what your impression was. And I don't think this adds any value to them, but it certainly will put people who don't want to do the work into a stressful situation where you're putting pressed people into safety critical roles, and that shouldn't happen. So that is an enhanced safety risk. But they'll cover themselves with paperwork and say, we did a risk assessment.
Well, I'm sorry. So just to try and paraphrase what you're saying, that they will be saying that they are operating at appropriate safety levels, but your interpretation is that at the very least it's a poorer safety level than you would normally be operating at.
Yeah, it imports risk by having people who are pressed to work.
And just a similar related subject before I go along to your colleagues there. In terms of the access for vulnerable and or disabled passengers, do you think they'd be able to manage that in the situation where you were in a minimum service level? Do you think there'd be any impact into that?
Well, the only way you can manage it adequately is by compelling more people to come to work. So much of the infrastructure is Victorian or of that area with lots of steps and footbridges and all the rest of it. That needs passenger assistance because the lifts aren't there. You will have to get people who people are maybe not thinking, like customer service staff who are not safety critical. If you want to keep that service going, you will have to bring them in. And if the government dictates that more stations should open on this timetable method rather than the priority route, that will mean more people being compelled to come in.
Okay. Anything you'd like to add, gentlemen? Or
I think the only thing I'd like to add is that when it comes to the times when these employers want to close ticket offices down, the issue around disabled access is one that we've banged on about a number of times in our responses and in our campaigns to try and stop that. But it's never an issue that they listen to. They still go ahead usually with those closures. So to say they're worried about disabled access and those sorts of things is always tempered at the very least, and sometimes just completely disregarded. So I think they speak with look in two different directions at the same time.
Yeah. Mr. Whelan?
From the number of groups that we deal with, passenger groups now, the evidence is they can't do it now. We do not serve disabled people and poorly sighted people very well at this moment in time. And we're not fulfilling our existing legal requirements in many of the companies. If many apologies for interrupting, but do you think that would degenerate in this situation even further? Even further, there will be less people to do it, and things will be more stretched. So quite obviously, if we can't fulfil our requirements now, going forward, it's going to be far more difficult. What's the second part of your question?
I think you've covered it actually in terms of where we are. The other point I want.
There was one further point. Just come back to me. Also, we're talking about health and safety. Part of the industrial health and safety we have is the scrutiny, and as part of the current dispute, many of our representatives, health and safety and otherwise, aren't being released to do their duties that actually scrutinise the safe operation of the companies in the current climate. So. I'm not quite sure, even as an industry at the moment, without these future changes, that we're totally operating safely.
Sorry, Mr. Jenks, you looked like you wanted to come in again.
Yeah, there's just one point I wanted to raise. We do a fair bit of work with disabled people. We got a group within TSSA, our disabled working group, who are very active in a lot of areas. And one of the things that they've drawn attention to is a number of derogations that are allowed by the government around various aspects of disabled access to railways and buses and things like that. These requirements to make change are continually being knocked back. We don't have to do this. We don't put the pressure on the company this month. Do it next month or next year or something, and then it's pushed back again. And in certain circumstances, it's been pushed back 5 or 6 times over a number of years. I think it's a point that's one of those, of course, is. I'll leave it at that.
Take on, don't bother what you're saying. Just on a completely different subject. Obviously, members of the public may have sympathy with your strike action, but for everybody, we all get into our own place. We always get into our ability to get to our jobs and things like this. And what the government's putting messages out there about putting minimum service levels in so they can help the essential workers get to work or whatever. What do you think the public actually would expect should these minimum service level things be delivered? Now, notwithstanding the complexities of delivery and all that sort of thing, but what do you think the public expectations are that based on what government communications have gone out? What do you think the public is actually seeing this? What would they expect to see?
Well, I think there's a danger that you're going to raise expectations through this to a level that will not be fulfilled. It's ironic, of course, that
the second part of my question was whether the expectations are realistic. So yes.
Yeah. When it started, we were told the essential workers have been held to ransom by RMT and others, and of course, all those essential workers have now been on strike themselves in the course of this action. So I think what the public, in my view, really dislike is when they're told this level of service is going to run and it's not fulfilled. And so I think there'll be even more anger when the chaos that's inevitable comes around and there's not a fulfilled minimum service level for whatever reason, not just us, but simply because nobody understands what they're doing. And I think there'll be more anger. And that's what we'll see.
I think the employer's part answered that question earlier when the question was asked about prioritisation on days, what services you're going to run and what routes you're going to run. So if the expectation for most people travelling is there's going to be some level of service, that may not be the truth based upon those key stations, that prioritisation I was talking about earlier. So quite simply, I think we're going to have not enough capacity for what does run, some areas where it won't run at all for obvious reasons, depending upon demand, and then a very frustrated travelling public.
Yeah. Anything to add, Mr. Jenks?
Well, I think I would add the issue of information as well. A lot of people see the trains are running, there's a minimum service level. If they get to thinking that far, the trains are running, turn up to the station and have long waits in between services because the information they've got is inadequate. Is it realistic to create that expectation in people? And like a friend of mine said to me at the weekend, I was talking over this with her, and she's a very avid Conservative supporter, and she said, well, don't people understand that's why it's 2-week notice? You can then make alternative arrangements. And I know that doesn't apply to everybody, but nevertheless, the fact is that there's already a 2-week notice between industrial action being declared and the date's been declared and the action actually taking place.
Yeah, I think that's obviously we've touched on earlier. There's the clarity between what's happening and when it's happening, and that which would help people to make their own decisions. But no, I thank you for your responses. Thank you, Chair.
And finally, Graham.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks very much. Just for the record, I'd like to make my declaration. I'm a member of several trade union groups, including Unite the Union, RMT, ASLEF. If TSSA had a parliamentary group, I'd probably be a member of that as well. I did 40 years ago. I was a member of TSSA and RMT all the time. It was the NUR prior to privatisation of the industry. But I tell you what, I'd like to ask, if I may. Thank you very much for the written evidence that's been submitted. And in the evidence, you point out that this proposed legislation is unfair, undemocratic, unworkable and unsafe. Now, in response to questions from my colleagues earlier, from Paul Howell in particular, to the train operators in the first panel, they implied that there were no safety concerns that hadn't been addressed to ensure the safety of the network. Do you have any further views in relation to that? I was thinking, and I raised this with the rail freight operators, about that dreadful Southall train disaster where a good friend of mine was killed a number of years ago. Is there some response you want to give for the record in relation to the safety concerns?
Well, I think the way that the railway works is that the duty holder, as they call them, has to be satisfied themselves that they will run a safe railway inside the legislation and inside the standards. And they decide whether that's true or not based on risk assessment and contingency. And then what's called the regulator, people assume this regulator goes around approving. They don't. They only are satisfied post-mortem, if you like, if that's where it comes from, that they did all that they should have done and they couldn't have foreseen it. So it's up to them to decide whether they run a safe railway. But if you want to run the railway on this basis, you will have to compel the fleet engineers to come in, which is my own grade, who then hand over the trains to the drivers, and then all the other grades will have to be satisfied, all their employers, and it's a multi-employer situation. They'll all be satisfied that they've got a safe regime. And if it all goes wrong, they will just say, well, we were satisfied at the time that we did what we can. But they've never factored into this the notion that you will compel these people to come to work. At the moment, nominally, the managers that are operating the railway largely, who are being incentivised, £500 a day, are willingly breaking the strikes. Yeah. It's a different scenario where you've got people who are unwillingly breaking the strike. And we think that is an inherent danger, either through stress or some other factors that they've got bringing to their safety critical work.
Are you having discussions with other agencies about the safety aspects of this? Have you raised your concerns with them?
Yeah, we called a special meeting with the ORR, the Chief Inspector, and he was I don't want to put him on the spot, but he was as oblivious as the rest of us about how this is going to work. But he outlined what I just said. We will engage with the employers and the companies and see that they've put safe systems of working, but they will just fudge over the issue about what it is to be compelled to go to work during a strike.
Well, you think it would be the issue would be in sharp focus for the ORR, because that was set up after those series of terrible train disasters, wasn't it?
They don't work in forward. They work after the fact of an incident.
Yeah. Just in conclusion, I wonder if I could just ask you, because when we've put this to ministers about why is this legislation being brought forward, and they've said, well, it's the norm in Europe. What discussions have you had, either through the International Transport Federation or through other organisations, with what is the situation in other countries, where they have sectoral collective bargaining and so on?
Yeah, most of those countries. I'll get out of the way in a minute. Most of those countries are covered by sectoral collective bargaining, so it's a different scenario. And as far as we've been informed by fellow trade unions, there has never been an enforcement of any of this legislation in any of the countries where it exists. As you say, it's honoured in the breach. But they do have a different formula of industrial action. So being on strike, on grève in France is a completely different scenario than we have, whether it's in America, Ireland, Britain. That sort of English-speaking world concept of trade unionism and industrial action doesn't apply over there, because they go for completely different scenarios. And they're allowed to strike against a lot more things. We can only strike against the employers. They go on strike against the government and all sorts of situations. And there were no minimum services in France recently.
Mick, you've got any views?
Yeah, quite simply, through the ETF and the ITF, we've had many conversations and we've got many shared experiences. And of course, of the nature of the companies that currently operate within the UK system, many of our reps actually sit on European Works Councils and get this information, see how it operates elsewhere. And the experience is, in European companies where they may have minimum service levels, they're never applied. They're generally not applied because they can't do it safely. Also, there's a different way in which union density and membership works. So you could have a union with very small density, but as you see in France, if anybody's called out on strike, it's not just a union concerned, it seems to be the whole world if it's a natural injustice. So, and also, they will still, regardless of those minimum service levels, retain the right to strike, which is a fundamental difference in what's being proposed here. And if I might just make a comment, I do wonder if all of this in all areas is just driven through the prism of where we are politically at the moment. Yeah. And in a post-COVID world, if we didn't have so many sectors out on strike at this moment in time, would any government actually be considering legislation of this kind? I don't know.
Mr. Jenks, do you have anything to add?
I don't have a great deal to add. What I do know is I did read just a bit about the situation in Italy, where nobody's ever been dismissed for breaching one of these notices, and that speaks volumes really about the way my colleagues have described how that works. And I think what it comes down to is the political point. This is a politically driven agenda. And when I mentioned earlier about the way the strikes have been prolonged because of inaction by the Secretary of State through the national rail contracts, I can't help but think that all this has been engineered to get to that stage where, oh look, we're in this situation, we need to do something about it, when they sat down and talked to the trade unions, allowed the employers to do what they want to do, and all could have been convinced to do, we would have not been in this situation, because the industrial action would have finished a long time ago. And it also goes to the point that the former chair of this committee, who's now got here somewhere, he said as much, that the cost of the strikes, the economic cost of the strikes to the nation would have been a lot less if we'd been talking much sooner. Yeah. And the unions were prepared to have those conversations.
Yeah. Well, let's hope we can get resolution to them. Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, gentlemen. Yeah. Chair.
Thank you. That brings us to the conclusion of the session. Can I thank all three of you for your time and evidence this morning. Order, order.